What was the place of music and songs in Luo culture? Culture can sometimes be loosely defined to the way a common people have determined to organize their affairs on a day-to-day basis. Culture is not the same with tradition. Culture and tradition on their face value appear the same, but in essence they are worlds apart. A tradition is a performance that a common people perpetuate over a long duration of time, but they don't know the reason for which they are doing that performance. A typical example would be the wearing of white wigs by black judges and black lawyers. The wearing of wigs, white wigs on a black head, is the most ridiculous of sights that anyone can behold. One ends up looking like a merino sheep. Let me demonstrate how the wearing of wigs emerged. In medieval times, when adversarial aspect of the legal system was getting entrenched, legal matters were highly contested. And so in order to safeguard and to protect the person who was seated adjudicating over matters, we needed to conceal their identity. A white face under a white wig would conceal the identity of the individual. It is also important to understand that courts were the extension of the king's private palaces. So the way people would sit in courts, the person adjudicating sitting in the place of the king was separated from the people who were proceeding the matter. The gallery, where the gallery was seated, was a long distance, a huge distance between the two. So it would easily conceal the person who was adjudicating. In our present courts, the sizes of a bed-sitter, however much you conceal your identity, we can just tell Mano Ondigo Wodotiu, who has made that pronouncement. If we need to still wear wigs, why don't we wear black wigs? Because a black wig will conceal the black identity of a black lawyer or a black judge. But let's go back to the story. So tradition is the performance of a thing without knowing the reason for which we are performing that thing. We have traditions in our families, we have traditions in our careers, we have traditions in our professions, we have traditions even in religion. Whenever you have been performing something over a long duration of time and you don't know the reason why you are performing it, chances are you have been left with the tradition. Culture is when an individual knows the reason for which they are making certain performance. Culture is always attached and connected with heritage, but heritage is not connected with tradition, because heritage is the value one derives from a practice, the value one derives from certain performance. That one is not with tradition. So in order for us to understand the place of the Luo, the music in the Luo culture, or music and songs in the Luo culture, it's important for us to ask ourselves, what is the Luo spirit? Does the Luo spirit have traits that separates it, makes it different from our neighboring communities? The Luo spirit, among many other features, has two distinct essence of that spirit. The Luo spirit is highly creative. The Luo spirit is highly expressive. So whenever we are interrogating cultural matters and whenever we are interrogating cultural affairs, it's important to distinguish what essence of the spirit championed that aspect of the culture. It is very important. What was the place of music in Luo culture? Did we start music by the coming of the colonizer, by the coming of the white man? No. In our olden days, we had music, but music was not approached from the way we are approaching music today. Music was entrenched. It's important for me to understand, to actually paint out how the Luo society was set up. The Luo society was set up on two distinct parallel institutions. We had the political system and the political structure, which was purely militarily, and we had the social setup or the social structure. The social structure was how we engaged amongst ourselves and how we engaged with our foreign neighbors, what today would be called as foreign policy. The military aspect was led by the champion at the apex of the military setup was Ruoth. Ruoth is Lord. One had to prove that you had the courage. One had to prove that you had the bravery to lead the community in matters of war, matters of aggression. It's important for me to demonstrate that in Luo culture, we did not have kingship that was as a function of blood lineage. No, we didn't. One had to prove himself if one needed to lead the community. One had to distinguish himself if one needed that the community to align themselves behind an individual. It is one of the reasons why in Luo Nation we don't do mentorship. In Luo Nation we don't do mentorship as a succession policy in politics or in leadership. One has to seize an opportunity and one has to demonstrate leadership traits. It is only at that point that the community would align themselves behind a leader. In Luo Nation, we didn't do succession. In Luo Nation, we didn't do mentorship. In Luo Nation, one had to distinguish themselves. So let's go back to the place of music. Music did not come to us as a function of the colonizers. We had music, well-established music. We had our own music instruments. We had people who are playing the music instruments. The order in which they would play the music instrument would be different from today, but we had players. It was an entire industry. We had oporo. Oporo is what would be the equivalent of the present day saxophone. Oporo was made from long horns, and the way someone would play the long horn and the intelligence with which one would respond with the different notation, oporo would produce different sounds. That was purely genius. We had asili, what today would qualify for a flute. Before the white man brought us the flute, we had asili. And asili, and the way the distance with which the holes were placed on the reed, the asili, would offer different notation depending with how someone played it. Which makes me believe in olden times we had what would be called the Luo scale. Before the white man brought us the major scale, the minor scale, the Dorian scale, the Phrygian scale, we had what we would call the Luo scale. Because the intelligence and the wisdom that would inform the placing of the different holes and where they would be, so that when a player is playing their asili, they would belt out different music, belting out different notes, was purely genius. So we had oporo, we had asili, we had orutu. Orutu is what we would call today the violin, although we still have orutu, but the genius and the intelligence, unlike the guitar that has the frets, orutu does not have the fret. So the intelligence of the individual to determine that if I place my finger at this part and if I play with this string thing, then it would belt out this melody, that was purely genius. And we had Orutu, we had Nyatiti. The place for music in our time, in our olden times, you remember back then, we didn't have calendars. So a huge part of our history, a huge part of our occurrence, a huge part of the festivals and the things we went to were captured in two things. They were captured in stories and captured in songs. We didn't have writing. The Luo nation in our olden times didn't have writing. So the way we would transmit knowledge, the way we would transmit historical events, the way we would transmit occurrence, that were only in two ways. We would either develop stories or we would develop music around it. So the place of music in Luo culture was to transmit information from one generation to another. There are songs in Luo culture, there are songs that we have in our heritage that when you sing them, they are pointing you to an event that happened. They are pointing you to a time, an era that happened. Because let me tell you what, contrary to our numbering, in olden times, we didn't have years, we didn't have months. The cycle of months was lunar cycle, and that lunar cycle was only to the extent that we would see a month. No one ever took time to number the days. Never be fooled. There were no numbering of days. The only thing that was in observing the moon, we would observe the cycles of the moon. That one was circular and that one was lunar. It is important also to understand that we didn't have calendar years, that this was the year 2006, 2015. No, we didn't have that. What we did was we numbered the years according to historical events. We numbered the years according to individuals. We numbered the years according to seasons and calamities. And all that was channeled through the medium of music. That is why to be a musician in Luo time, to be a musician in olden times was the highest honor that a community would bestow on an individual. Poets and musicians and instrumentalists were people that were highly honored because these were people who are trusted to capture the full breadth of the culture and to capture the full breadth of all our performance and to store it in a way that would be transmitted. Songs back then were not 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Song back then would go even for hours. In every homestead, I remember there's a time I lived with my uncle. He's called Obwanda Osom. I lived with Obwanda for 4 years. This gentleman, every evening after dinner, the gentleman would sit under a tree and the gentleman would belt out melodies to the late hours of the evening, around 10 p.m., 11 p.m. thereabout, and the gentleman will narrate to us battles that he took part in, battles that he also had. The gentleman would narrate to us personalities that existed and what those personalities taught. The gentleman would narrate to us how we migrated from one place to another. And that is how music was approached. Music was not career. Music was an institution within the Luo culture that would be entrusted with transmitting information, that would be entrusted with transmitting the full breadth of the nation, the full breadth of a clan to the next generation. Musicians were librarians. Music was library. And that is how we approached music. Today, on this Ngolo Sunday, I wanted us to go back and view music. And if we can approach it from that angle, then we can start to understand, particularly if you can get a song that was sung in the olden times, that song is coded with messages. Those songs were coded with messages. It's important that we approach music from that angle. Musicians were librarians. The Udi, making learning language simpler.